And I can't help but to think about Breonna Taylor as well, and the conversations around the dynamic of how we talk about what happens with women in this country and beyond as well. The detectives who and police officers who worked on the search warrant, and the ex-officer who was accused, of course, of firing blindly into her home. They've been charged with civil rights violations and other counts, as he articulated. What's your reaction to this? And tell us why this is so impactful.
Well, look, this is impactful because as people know, we know that on March 13th of 2020, at pretty much the beginning of the pandemic, that Breonna Taylor was killed in her home by a search warrant where they were supposedly looking for one of her ex-boyfriends who was not there, and it led to her death. Now, we know that there were charges originally in Louisville and in the state of Kentucky where the officers were not convicted of anything related to Breonna Taylor's killing, but instead, some of them were convicted for shooting into the drywall between her apartment and her neighbor's apartment, which is also part of this Department of Justice uh, investigation and part of these charges. What's currently happening, as Merrick Garland noted, is lying on the search warrant, obstructing investigators from doing their job. And I want to go really deep into how this plays out. If this group of officers, who are probably, at least collectively at the time, were very high level, they went in, they did these search warrants, they went into people's homes. Of course, people sometimes think about TV shows, whether that be, Chicago PD or some other shows where we see this playing out. But officers oftentimes view this as if time is of the essence. And oftentimes it is, where they're like, okay, we have to take advantage of this situation because we have gotten credible evidence that a person who we are looking for is here. Well, as you know, Laura, being a lawyer, there's a process that has to go through. You have to get a judge to sign off on these search warrants, and at times officers can get in so much of a hurry that they try to obscure, they try to skate around, they try to manipulate that search warrant to get it their way. And that might mean forgery or lying about information to try to get that to happen. And evidently the Department of Justice feels like that's the case. There's another part of this that I think that's important, very, very important for people, which is one of the things that Merrick Garland said is that these officers allegedly met in a garage to conspire on what they would say to investigators. This is not unusual. So part of this is a larger political process at play with this administration to say we will not tolerate officers doing that anymore. Of course, we also have to think about that Louisville PD has been under investigation by the Department of Justice. So I view this as part of that. But that conspiring is important because of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. Officers can oftentimes wait to give their statement. They can look at evidence. They can meet with their fraternal order of police representative. And then after they have all that information, they can craft a story that aligns with the information that investigators have. And I think that happened in this case. And I think it's something that is highly problematic. It allows these bad apple officers to continue to proliferate, but it also sets a normative culture that police officers are above the law. And I think this Department of Justice is aiming to implement an auto correction.
So walk us back a little bit about this Officers' Bill of Rights. I mean, I remember it was in the news for some time talking about when it was first introduced and why, and it was not without controversy.
Yeah, so the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, it actually started actually in the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland was one of the first states to implement it in the 1970s. It's important to note that the state of Maryland just last year was pretty much the first state to repeal it. That is important. Part of what the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights allows officers to do, at least that's the way people perceive it, it allows them to be above the law. Part of what people who are critical of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights says is that it becomes impossible to discipline and remove bad officers. So what it mostly deals with is due process. What sort of due process do officers receive? And they get, because they are police officers, more privileges with that due process that a lot of people feel is notable. And so accordingly, when we think about that, part of what that means is as I was mentioning, it allows officers to have more time to make their statement. It allows them to review evidence. It allows them to meet with their fraternal order police representative. And in some cases, a normal citizen could definitely say, I'm going to, wait for my attorney to come. But the other part of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights is that officers can get in trouble, actually convicted of crimes outside of work, and actually not lose their jobs because of LEBOR. Now, there are a lot of people who say, look, that should just not be the case. If an officer has been convicted of domestic violence, if they have been convicted of reckless driving, if they have been convicted of assault, then that should have implications for their jobs. But the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights actually provides a series of protections for officers when it comes to these particular outcomes.
And do you think that the family views this as a step towards justice?
I think so, but look, I think the convictions will be a big part of it. I mean, I also, in some ways, think about the speed at which this has happened. And Laura, you know this. I mean, I think 2 years, not even 2.5 years. I mean, that's pretty good with some of these type of cases. I mean, we're starting to get condensed with the timeline. I think it's not just about them being charged. I think it becomes about them being convicted. And I think partly we also have to think about, for some of these officers, they have been pretty outspoken. I mean, after they were found not guilty, I mean, it's been, books have been written. People have went on talk shows to talk about this. And then, of course, it becomes political and racialized in an entirely different way. When all we need to remember is, look, the person that these people were looking for was not there. They went into this woman's home and she was killed. And as much as we talk about this, people say, oh, well, the current boyfriend, the current fiance shot back. He was defending his home under the Castle Doctrine because he didn't know that the individuals who entered his home were police officers. This is the reason why he was not convicted of any crimes. Why charges were actually dropped against him was for that reason. So we have to put this in its totality, that this incident, it also speaks to a very troubling statistic that you noted earlier. And it's the simple fact, and a troubling stat, that Black women are significantly more likely than all other groups to be killed in their homes. I mean, just killed in your homes. It speaks to the maternal mortality outcomes that Black women experience. I mean, people necessarily don't see these links in how certain people's bodies are marginalized, whether they are at home or whether they are in a hospital. And these are spaces that are supposed to be protecting people.
There is an impact on the officer morale and the officer's willingness at times to do the job when they are faced with the prospect of prosecution. Did this come up in your training and conversations with law enforcement?
Most definitely. I mean, at the University of Maryland, we have a virtual reality training program that is second to none. And officers come in, they are excited to do the training. They are excited to do advanced training. Overwhelmingly, officers are excited about ways to improve their job performance, improve outcomes. But officers do worry about potential criminal charges. And part of what they worry about is how their training record can be used against them in court, which is one of the reasons why when officers interact with us, we anonymize everything. We take police departments through, police units through, give what we call an aggregate report of everyone instead of individually, because we definitely want to protect officers who are coming in being vulnerable to get better at their jobs and think of different ways in which they can be objective and use more communication. But officers definitely express that they are worried about these sort of things. And I'll tell you, there are all sort of tricks that law enforcement administrators use, that individuals who are in leadership use to try to coerce or prevent officers from being transparent. And we have to be very clear about that. The stigma of speaking up and speaking out against other officers is grave. And I have seen some departments who say, no, we're not just going to let our officers go through the training. We're going to actually know which officers go through, and we are going to put how they perform in their training file. And that is something that we don't necessarily think should be happening, but I do think that is something that will move forward. And there are a lot of people who think that should be the case. I think when it comes to morale, it's two different sides of it. People think that the morale leads to the Ferguson effect that a lot of people hear about, which is the fact that officers are less likely to do their job. Well, it's very clear that it hasn't changed use of force in police killings. That has not decreased over the past decade. If we go back 10 years from when Trayvon Martin was initially killed by George Zimmerman, which really catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously, The other thing about it, though, is that it does impact morale internally. So we see that that's a lot of things that people don't talk about because we have interviewed hundreds of police officers and worked with thousands of them. We see what impact it has internally on morale. And part of what I know is that hurts people. It spills over from police precincts onto the streets that they police. And that is something that we don't talk enough about. And accordingly, I don't think we talk enough about how these use of force incidents, whether it be what happened with Breonna Taylor or whether it happened with George Floyd and other individuals that we can name, that these sort of things impact officers. Officers are saddened, they are disappointed. Some of them who are part of these incidents are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that that outcome happened. And of course, we could talk about how implicit bias and explicit bias is baked into that. But my overall point is that it has an internal impact on officers' mental health, and it also has an impact on organizational culture.
Do you think people, and this is I don't mean this to be, antagonistic, but why should people care about that? If you are not the law enforcement, why is that still impactful to even those who are not members of law enforcement?
Yeah, well, I think first, look, police officers are human beings just like the rest of us. And they're going out trying to do a job that I think is arguably one of the most difficult jobs that we have in the United States, particularly once you compound the current political climate and racial climate that we're in. The other big thing is that what happens internally does spill over to impact us. And partly it deals with mental health. One of the things that a large study found on law enforcement, and I've done the analysis for this particular data set, is that overwhelmingly about 80% of police officers suffer from chronic stress. Chronic stress includes depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, family problems, relationship problems. 1 out of 6 of these officers, every 1 out of 6, report substance abuse problems. They also report suicidal thoughts. And partly the reason how this stigma happens is because it's stigmatized to seek help and ask for help. There are some departments that I'm seeing that are making advances in this area that are requiring officers to get mental health treatment that normalizes it where they won't be stigmatized. But when officers are not operating at their full capacity, when they are not mentally healthy, they will make mistakes. Whether or not those mistakes are about social class, about race, about place, they will make them. And so the use of force cases that we continue to see is because officers are impacted by the pandemic, by the political climate, and by the racial climate, just like everyone else. It's just rarely do we have the insight to actually gain their perspective like I've been able to do in my research over the years.
Really important to hear your insight in particular. Dr. Rashawn Ray, everyone, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution and an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland. I'm glad you stopped by. Thank you for being a part of the program, as always.
Thank you.
You can always check for him as well as a guest host here on
Rashawn, I'm saving those now for you, too, the whole shows. It just takes a little while, and I'll get them over to you, okay?
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Tony.
Oh, it's the market watching.
Thank you. Talk to you next time. Bye.
All right, bye.